Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 5 of Introduction to Human Rights. It's hard to believe, but January is almost over. We're nearly a third of the way into our semester here. It's really flying by. I hope your semesters are all going well. I know you're all doing very well in this class so far, so I hope that's the case for your other classes as well. So in this video, as usual, I will kind of give a recap of last week's blog posts, introduce the topic for next week, and some things to think about. So this past week for blog post 4, you were tasked with reading and writing about some international human rights enforcement mechanisms. And I think that Elena Sanders did a good job of summing up the purpose of these different bodies with analogies she made. She said that having established human rights rules without any ways to enforce them would be like a country having laws but no police officers. So essentially, when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was passed and these other human rights treaties and conventions have been signed, there was really no international system in place to enforce these human rights laws, to promote them, to ensure that they were continually being updated and respected. So the various committees and conventions that you wrote and read and wrote about this past week were designed to provide a way for the international community to come together and ensure that these rights were being respected. And as you saw, there's a mixed record of effectiveness. And so there are some cases, which hopefully you'll be writing about in your human rights case study essays, where these things have worked, where the enforcement mechanisms have taken place and countries, governments have been brought to justice, the rights of individuals have been protected. However, there's certainly many other times when that has not been the case. And as we discussed last week in sort of the vertical or international human rights trends versus the horizontal or domestic trends in human rights, generally speaking, the international human rights enforcement mechanisms are not nearly as effective or accessible as law enforcement mechanisms within a stable single country. That being said, you read and wrote about numerous committees that are designed to protect the rights of specific individuals or specific categories of human rights. So you all picked several different ones. I was pleased with the variety. You wrote about the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW, the Committee on the Rights of the Child, Committee on Migrant Workers, Committee on Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, and the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and the Committee Against Torture. So you can see some of these groups are designed to protect certain populations, so women, children, migrants. Others deal with particular issues related to human rights, so racism and discrimination, torture, etc. So just wanted to point out a few interesting takeaways from when I read your post. One thing that struck me was that many of you sort of introduced the committee you were writing about with why you were personally interested. Some of you talked about as a parent, you're interested in the Committee on Rights of the Child, or having a family member with a disability, you were particularly interested in the Committee on for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Really appreciated sort of having that background of why you were interested in a certain topic, and I think anytime you can kind of connect what's happening in your life or in current events to the readings and the discussions, that's great. So thank you all for sharing that information. And then I wanted to just talk about a couple of issues of sort of membership in these different bodies. So some of you mentioned that the United States has not fully ratified all aspects of the Committee on the Rights of the Child, and the United States is not a member party of the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. So certainly critics would cite that as a real sort of black mark on the United States as one of the supposed leaders of democracy and human rights. How could you not have signed on to these bodies that are served to protect children and women? And there's various rationales and reasons for why the United States has opted not to sign on to these. The primary one is that proponents would say in the United States we have laws domestically or horizontal trends which meet or more often than not exceed the protections offered in these two conventions. However, that certainly is one side of the story, but it also begs the question of what sort of impression or role model are you setting by not participating in these groups. Another argument that opponents of U.S. ratification of these two bodies or other international human rights mechanisms in general have cited is that when you look sometimes at who is a member to these and their record of human rights in these areas, there's sort of a question of hypocrisy. So, for example, 2 weeks ago, you all wrote about Rahaf al-Qunun, a young woman from Saudi Arabia, who, documented several violations of her human rights, particularly related to discrimination and limitations she faced as a woman in that country. It's worth noting, though, that Saudi Arabia is a member of CEDAW, or the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. So how is that possible, you might ask, that Saudi Arabia, who, as you all felt in your blog post, is clearly not respecting the basic human rights of women, how can they be a part of the committee that's supposed to be enforcing these rights? So an important thing to note is that typically with these human rights conventions, countries can sign on, but at varying levels. They can sign on with no reservations, fully ratified, fully party to it, or they can sign on with what are called reservations. These are notes that they say, yes, we agree to this in principle, but we have reservations, either some of the principles or specific points of it. So if you look on the United Nations website for CEDAW and you click on Saudi Arabia under its list as a member, you'll see two reservations. So one is a statement that where aspects of the Convention on the Elimination of Against Discrimination of Women, where that convention conflicts with Islamic law would take precedence. So in other words, in their interpretation, if they feel that certain questions about marriage, for example, what is in CEDAW is not consistent with their interpretation of Islamic law, then their interpretation of Islamic law would take precedence and over take precedence over whatever is in CEDAW. And then they also listed reservations about a few particular areas of it where they just said right off the bat, we don't agree with these aspects. So there's reservations, there's pros and cons to that. On one hand, you can bring more countries into the fold. Certainly you can make the argument it's better to have Saudi Arabia at the table, hearing about these issues, discussing them, at least party to some aspects of it. The other hand, though, you certainly can make a question of what's the point. If a country can just sort of pick and choose which aspects of these conventions they want to honor or not, then what is the validity that they have? So certainly some questions of meat. And if you're wondering, how can these human rights violations persist when these agreements are in place, reservations is certainly one explanation for that. So those were some of my big observations from last week. Again, I think I appreciated that you all picked several different committees. You did a good job covering how they were founded, what their role is, what some of the progress they've made, as well as limitations. I encourage you as you're reading your classmates' posts to pay special attention to those who wrote about different committees than you did so that you can learn about what's out there. You all did well. So moving ahead to this week, in the fifth module, the fifth weekly module, the course is sort of broken up into a few different sections, and we just sort of wrapped up the first chunk, which is gaining an understanding of broadly what is the concept of human rights and what does it look like in the world today. So we talked about defining human rights, the sort of historical, philosophical, and religious backgrounds for human rights, the modern development of human rights after World War II, and then the mechanisms that are in place to promote and enforce those human rights. For the next few weeks, we're going to be moving into some special topics in human rights. So just like y'all wrote about different committees that dealt with different issues, we'll be looking at sort of specific issues that pertain to human rights. And this coming week, we're going to be looking at conflicts or war and international crimes. And this fits into an area we have been focused previously on international human rights law. Now we'll be looking at international humanitarian law. So the difference between human rights law and international humanitarian law is that international humanitarian law pertains specifically to human rights violation that take place in war zones and times of conflict. So you'll read about 20-30 pages out of the Haas textbook, which really outlines international humanitarian law. And then I'm going to have you look at the Council on Foreign Relations website, which has something called the Global Conflict Tracker. It's a really neat interactive website. It has a map of the world and different conflict zones and some background information about them. So for your next week's blog post, you'll be asked to pick a conflict from this website of your choosing, provide some background of it, and some explanations of aspects of international humanitarian law that pertain to that conflict. The other thing that I'm going to have you do for this week is kind of consider what may be a brewing global conflict. If you've been following the news lately, the country of Venezuela has been front and center in international news. Venezuela has had pressing economic and political issues for many years, but that's really come to a head, say within the last year, and then particularly in the last 2 weeks. The Venezuelan economy has been on a steady decline. A lot of corruption in the government, some would say questionable validity of their most recent elections. About 3 million Venezuelans have fled the country over the last year, and many people are facing starvation or near starvation due to lack of food and hyperinflation, or the rapid increase in the prices of goods, particularly food. So about a week ago, a politician in Venezuela who is the leader of the National Assembly declared himself interim president. So right now there are two sort of parallel competing presidents in Venezuela. The United States, several European countries, and other Latin American countries have backed this new interim president, where Russia, China, Cuba, and Iran have continued to back Maduro, the current president. And there's a big question as to what will happen. Will someone back down? Will the military remain loyal to the president of Venezuela? To what extent will other countries intervene to support this interim president and sort of oust Maduro? And what will the general population in Venezuela do? Will they continue to support the government, or, as recent protests indicate, will they really start to flip and turn on them? So certainly a real boiling cauldron of tension in that country, and questions about what will happen. So I'm going to have you read a couple articles about what's going on in Venezuela, give your take on the situation in the country from a human rights perspective, and then from an international humanitarian law perspective. Basically, I'll ask you the question is, would support in an armed conflict be justified in the country of Venezuela under international humanitarian law principles? So that is what is coming up this week. And also definitely continue working on your essay, which will be due in March. You want to keep working on that. Let me know if you have any questions or concerns. Again, I really appreciated your post last week, and I look forward to reading next week's post. I hope you all have a great rest of the week. Take care.